Hong Kong Association of Energy Service Companies. Last year at EcoAsia, this is talking about the personal responsibility issue. I conducted an ad hoc survey of all the people that had an exhibition booth in the green Hong Kong section. Now, I think we should do a lot more of this, and I encourage the speaker to ask this very question afterwards. 98% of the people that I had interviewed, these were eco-friendly companies. These are companies producing super-duper plastic products or super-duper waste handling, etc. None of them, well, 98% had not conducted any energy audit or any carbon audit or any environmental study on their business during the previous year. Now, it seems to me that if we as consumers are buying these products, surely we should be asking the questions, first of all, about where these are coming from. And these companies that are obviously just in the market for selling stuff, don't really care what environmental damage they've done or are doing, or they're trying to promote their new plastic, whatever. I think I think there needs to be a lot more thought given to, in forums like this, I would think maybe 50% of the businesses or organizations would have had done an audit. But I'd be interested to know the exact number. And I think we can sort of set the standard to see how things can progress in the future.
Oh, hi, David Sadaway. I'm at the University of Hong Kong, and I study urban planning. So I've been very interested in the discussion about cities. And I guess I have two perhaps related comments and then a question for, particularly for Jeannie. Right-sizing, the comment about right-sizing I found interesting. And actually, right now, Detroit is talking about right-sizing Detroit in terms of its footprint. A city that, has gone through a lot, going back from the race riots to the white flight to the deindustrialization and, most symbolic of the demise of the North American motor industry. But Detroit is looking at, I was just reading a couple of days ago on a blog, Detroit is looking at how to create, how to sort of assemble land so that there's much more sort of smart shrinking going on. And I think that's something that in the developed world we often talk about growth, providing more infrastructure, building more bridges, so on and so forth. And all of those planning, from an urban planning perspective, all of the models are premised on growth, including energy consumption. And I think in the developed world, we're going to have to start talking more, especially with our demographics. If we look at Japan, if we look at Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and increasingly in China, unless the One China policies change, a lot of this part of the world is going to have to be looking at changing demographics. And as a result, we're going to have to rethink how we do cities. It's not as much of an issue in Asia, where we have much more compact and dense cities compared to, say, the North American model. So the right sizing, I think, is an interesting point, both on a personal level, but also on an urban region level. And I guess my question to Jeannie, I found your comments insightful as well. But I did have I have a personal issue with the nuclear industry being touted as, in quotes, a green energy alternative for a number of reasons, particularly if we're looking at a long-term question of sustainability, right? We're dealing with sort of apples and oranges issues, in my opinion, because if we look at sort of Sokolow's wedges, the Princeton economists' wedges, where we can invoke different energy alternatives, whether it's renewables, whether it's demand management, cogeneration, so on and so forth. I think nuclear is a special case, particularly because if we look at the full life cycle of nuclear, I'm from Canada, uranium extraction happens in Canada, and there's a very strong reason why uranium extraction is very problematic. For example, the province of British Columbia has banned, there's a complete moratorium on uranium mining of high-grade ores in that province, because if any of that high-grade ore gets into a watershed, community watershed, will be nuked, right? I'm not a nuclear expert, but we just know from sort of the worst case scenarios, and oftentimes environmental advocates are accused of being scaremongers and so on and so forth. But if we know those, if we recall those oral histories, both in terms of experiential knowledge, but also in terms of scientific knowledge, we recall, Chernobyl, we recall 3 Mile Island, and there's a lot more going on than that. So let's begin with the full life cycle of the nuclear industry and look at what's happened in terms of the mining, in terms of the transportation, in terms of the siting of the plants, in terms of what is the how is the local community dealing with the siting? I mean, if we put a plant up, we're not going to be putting it in Hong Kong. It's going to be going in Guangdong, next to a much poorer community. So there's an environmental justice. I mean, there already is a plant in Daya Bay, but there's an fundamental environmental justice question there. Now, someone like Amory Lovins, who's a physicist at the Rocky Mountain.
Can I just ask you to get to your specific
Sorry,
question?
I could go on all day about nuclear, but I guess the point is, why aren't we having a discussion about these kind of alternatives, which I think there's a lot of positive alternatives. So I think my question is, why isn't the public being invited into these discussions? And I mean, I guess we could say we're having one here today. But I mean, I think when we look at some of these alternatives, there are real issues of path dependencies. And a lot of it comes down on a city level, who are these alternative, who's paying the costs and who's getting the benefits. Thank you.
Absolutely agree. I think that was the whole point. I think the issue is every type of technology or any type of energy, as I mentioned, has its pros and cons. So even solar, I mean, everybody's saying, okay, solar is so much solar energy, but look at the process for actually manufacturing the solar panels, for instance. And we don't even know what the impacts are later on when you're talking about decommissioning or when these panels go down. Right now, they're supposed to last for 40 years, but we're not sure until it actually happens. So there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of the whole LCA of any type of energy. So yes, we agree. I mean, nuclear, we're not saying, and I don't like to say any type of energy really is green, because I think every type of energy has an environmental footprint, and it will have its impacts. There are no zero emissions type of energy. It just doesn't really exist from an LCA perspective. But having said that, because climate change is very urgent, so for one particular point I want to make is because climate change is so urgent, and in the short term, we really don't have a lot of alternatives, especially for countries that are developing as fast as, for instance, India and China are, that from that perspective and from their perspective of equity, of why is it that they're not allowed to develop, why is it that they're not allowed to have energy, in the short term, if today they need energy today, what are the options? Unfortunately, nuclear is one of the more proven technologies. Now, having said that, I agree, and in fact, this is going back to the point of the lessons learned in the past. Technologies actually advance because of failures. Technologies don't advance when they don't have failures. And actually, I think the nuclear industry has advanced quite a lot because of those failures. It does come down to the point, and I absolutely agree with you, is how do we manage the whole process of managing all of the environmental and social impacts, not just the environmental part as well. Even hydro, for instance, has had its issues and will continue to have its issues. But if you look at the International Hydro Association, they're trying to get their heads wrapped around how at every single stage we try to manage all of those impacts. That's the best we can do. Because again, it's what is the lesser of all the evils that are around. And so I think even with nuclear, yes, we will have to face that issue. We will have to face the issue of, from upstream, what countries, Canada's probably, and I'm Canadian and I understand those issues as well, but I look at Australia, and what's interesting about Australia is, they're not having any nuclear power stations because their public won't accept it, and yet they're exporting all their uranium for other nuclear plants around the world. So it's, in a way, it's kind of a choice of each country to make in terms of their energy policy, in terms of where their energy can come from. But yes, definitely, I think being responsible for any type of energy, and it's not just nuclear. You're right. I mean, nuclear has its problems. Even the decommissioning part, none of us really know how to really do it, because all we can say is let's let it lie for 100 years, and then the radioactivity will be at that half-life that theoretically should not be as damaging as when it first comes out. So then So then the technologies lie in how do you store it to make sure that it does not get into contact with the communities. Going back to siting, that issue of siting, yes. I mean, if there are already nuclear power stations in existence, then there does tend to be, why don't we site it there, since it's already proven in the sense that that's a good area to be in, and you know, all of the facilities, supporting facilities are there, so it's efficient, whether it's collection of the spent fuel, for instance. All of that could be better managed, better controlled. You don't want it all spread out. So yes, there are challenges, and I think we definitely do need to talk about them and to get them out into the community for more discussion.
Thank you. Robert, the final question. Oh, and one more afterwards. Yes, please go ahead, Robert.
Thank you. Ban Ki-moon has asked the Inter-Academy Council of Sciences to report by August on the working of the IPCC. Would the panel agree that the big problem with the IPC is that it's grossly under-resourced? It has somewhere 20 to 40 people, mainly administrators, I think based in Geneva. Its chairs are part-time. They have to earn a salary elsewhere. It has very little in the way of sort of communications infrastructure. You know, given the importance of the climate change problem, shouldn't the world be having a much stronger executive with good communications to cover this? And maybe we could get their reports out in less than 5 years.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. You know, the analytic work that goes into all these processes is probably shortchanged, and we would get better results. I've been on one panel of the National Academy of Sciences in the U.S., and I think the consensus method that's used for these bodies is also a problem. You know, people get a veto power, and I think the reports have generally been a little bit out of date by the time they're published. I think another problem with the science community is they, as much as they try, they still do talk in jargon, and so when they're testifying before a congressional committee or something like that, they don't explain themselves as well as they could. I've also been critical of scientists who regard it as kind of an outrage if someone wants to see the assumptions of their model. I think they've gotten sloppy intellectually because they're dealing with students a lot of times, and in the real world you have to share your assumptions or people don't find it credible. So I think the science community has to accept some responsibility for not having explained this better. I illustrated back when President Carter was president. If you take the study of the National Academy of Sciences, which came out in '79, and then the letters to President Carter. The letters to President Carter is, this is a big problem, and we need to do something about it right away. And no scientist would say that in public because they weren't allowed to say it. And in the public, if you read that study, which I believe is the first one, you know, where you had a consensus across a broad national perspective, if you read it carefully, there was complete agreement on the science of climate change. But the word uncertainty was used in there about 27 times. I can go back and get the exact number, because they were actually applying for grants. They were using this study to highlight the areas of uncertainty, usually on more minor points, so they could get more money. So I think that everybody, I think the economists, until the Stern report came out, were giving very one-sided studies of economics. I think the scientists who have basically been right about this bear some responsibility, and all of us as individuals. I myself, looking back on my career, wish I'd focused on this a little bit earlier. So we all have work to do, and hopefully the analytic capabilities will get beefed up, because the stakes of energy are real high. I mean, it's a big part of the economy, and you know, one thing in oil, we always say, if you have an oil dust up, there's always been a recession afterwards. Now maybe that's an accident, but the stakes are really large here, so I agree totally that the resources should be there for what's needed.
Jay Lau from CLP. I think the question is for Mr. Jakes. I'd like you to comment on the actions taken by the two developing countries, China and India, both countries have their own action plans.